means that the West, especially, has access to the impoverished, dispossessed, and refugee population of almost the rest of the entire world as a potential source of surplus labor. Now, it should be clear that if oppression is constitutive of class society, then we cannot possibly hope to be fully rid of oppression until we get rid of capitalism, until we get rid of the ruling class. But we clearly cannot wait till after the revolution to challenge oppression today. How can the working class hope to overthrow capitalism if it is divided against itself by racism, sexism, homophobia, etc.? How can it hope to be strong enough to defeat the most powerful ruling class in history if it allows trans workers, disabled workers, undocumented workers to be weakened and made vulnerable? The strength of the whole class is sapped by these special oppressions, and we cannot hope to win the revolutionary struggle without also improving the position of the vulnerable sections of the class. So the question is, how can the working class overcome the divisions and weaknesses which capitalism has foisted on it by means of these oppressions? Now, the ABC of Marxism is that ideas change in the struggle itself. In other words, every effort, even very small ones, to challenge capitalism also shakes up dominant ideologies. The class struggle has a kind of accumulation of its own. The more workers struggle, the more likely they are to discover their strength, the more other workers are likely to join them, the more they are forced to reckon with who can really be an ally and who the real enemy is. And the more struggles deepen, the more they come up against the chauvinism and bigotry that we have absorbed. The more fundamentally are we required to rethink our understanding of the world and each other. Or as Marx put it, for the production on a mass scale of a communist consciousness and for the success of the cause itself, the alteration of men on a mass scale, men and women, and non-binaries, is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement, a revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only, in a revolution, succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. Thus far, this is, as I said, the ABC of Marxist theory of revolution. Without an understanding of the transformative nature of the class struggle, the entire socialist project falls down. This is the cornerstone of Marxist theory of praxis, and this is why the very fact that workers must struggle, often simply to survive, gives us confidence, or should give us confidence, that oppression really can be overcome. But much turns on how we interpret this idea. Some Marxists, more optimistic than myself, like to point out that the stratification of the working class has a contradictory dynamic. That the constant restructuring of the labor force also means that many workplaces are quite diverse. A single factory can employ men and women, whites and people of color, straights and queer people, cis and trans people, etc. On this basis, an article in the UK's Socialist Worker titled "How Do Ideas Change?" points out, quote, "When people go on strike, for example, they find themselves in a collective battle against the bosses. When this happens, ruling class ideas can begin to break down. Racist and sexist ideas make less sense when black and white people, men and women, stand together against a common enemy. When this happens, the conflict between workers on one hand and bosses on the other is laid bare." Correct as far as it goes, although it makes it sound kind of passive, as though black people and white people are not actively challenging the chauvinistic ideas of the workers who were striking at the time. Anyway, I don't exactly disagree with the comment. I just think that if you stop there, it can be kind of facile. For one, I think it underestimates the degree that segregation continues to exist in the workplace. There's still quite a great deal of that. You have workplaces that are almost entirely made up of undocumented workers, and you have workplaces that have no undocumented workers, right? So like, when are you going to strike together? It's not something that happens easily. But more importantly than that, I think it underestimates just what a powerful fortress oppression is for the ruling class. So for argument's sake, for rhetorical sake, I'm obviously caricaturing the position of the article a bit, as a form of what I want to do. But I do think that we need to avoid what Lenin calls economism in our image of what constitutes the class struggle. On its own, the article can suggest a certain passivity regarding racism or sexism, as though the logic of the strike can be trusted simply to sweep them away. It's only a slight improvement to say that the strike provides anti-sexist and anti-racist with an excellent opportunity to make their arguments, although of course it would be true to say that. My argument, I want to go a bit further, is that specific articulations of oppression, such as racism, are such powerful weapons for the capitalist class's rule that unless they are challenged directly and considerably weakened, the working class struggles in vain. Failene quoted Marx's letter on the anti-Irish chauvinism of the English working class in his day. This is one of the most important documents of Marx's theory of revolution, and I want to take a closer look at it. Marx says that the antagonism between Anglo and Irish workers is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. Now, the working class at that time was one of the best organized in the world. In spite of this organization, I want to underline that, it was still unable to overcome anti-Irish chauvinism and the hostility against the Anglo workers that this inspired among the Irish. This was the root of what Marx called their impotence and the secret of the ruling class's power in England. As Marx studied the Irish question, he became convinced that the colonial oppression of the Irish was the most important stronghold for English capitalism. Not only did the dispossession of the Irish provide the English metropole with a steady stream of surplus labor, which it could use against English workers, it also justified the massive repressive apparatus of the state. But the antagonism generated within the working class itself was considered by Marx to be the most important, quote, of all these factors. In an earlier letter on the same topic, Marx had written that the English workers will, quote, will never do anything decisive here in England before they separate their attitudes towards Ireland quite definitely from that of the ruling classes. Every movement in England is itself crippled by the dissension with the Irish. Marx's conclusion is radical even in terms of socialist theory, both today and in his time. He says, the decisive blow against the English ruling classes, and it will be decisive for the workers' movement all over the world, cannot be delivered in England, but only in Ireland. This is clearly an anticipation of Lenin's theory of the weakest link, whereby the most vulnerable part of the imperialist chain sort of starts the revolution internationally. But what I find interesting for our purposes is what this implies for the English working class itself. And there are three key implications, I think. The English working class could not hope to emancipate themselves until the colonial oppression of Ireland had been ended. That's one. Two, the development of the English working class as a revolutionary class capable of overthrowing capitalism in England depended utterly on the independent self-activity of the oppressed Irish people. I want to really emphasize this point. The English working class could not overcome their anti-Irish chauvinism on their own. To a considerable extent, their development hinged on the actions of the Irish, that is to say, on the resistance of an oppressed minority. The third implication has to do with how revolutionaries should approach the problem of working class unity in the context of chauvinism. If what I've been talking about so far looks a bit like Lenin's theory of the weakest link, it also has some bearings on how we understand the idea of vanguard. Marx is so convinced of the need to support Ireland that he threw himself into solidarity work with the Fenian struggle, even though this put him into opposition with the mainstream of the English working class. His advice to his German immigrant comrades in the US was similar. So, quote, the greatest achievement you can bring now, Marx suggests, would be a coalition of the German workers with the Irish workers, adding only in a parenthetical, and of course also with the English and American workers who are prepared to accede to it. This is not because Marx thought revolutionaries in the US could simply afford to ignore American workers, but because revolutionary activity with those workers could not be done on the basis of opportunism that disregarded their bigotry. Marx trusted, rather, that with patient work, the struggle of this coalition could provide the basis for a challenge to mainstream chauvinism, and therefore lay the foundation for principled unity. I was a bit surprised when researching this talk how much this approach parallels the approach of Trotsky, C.L.R. James, and the American Socialist Workers' Party towards what they call the Negro question in the 30s and 40s. And I apologize for some of the language here. It's obviously a bit dated. Anyway, in presenting the material for the SWP's discussion on this issue, C.L.R. James shows that the American ruling class had often and very consciously deployed anti-black racism against the working class. Attacks on blacks were often very often the cutting edge of a wedge that eventually hurt all workers. Now, Trotsky uses the theory of the aristocracy of labor to frame his ideas, and it is kind of a problematic theory, but I don't have time to get into all the problems with it. But I wanted to use his points anyway because it makes some interesting programmatic remarks. So according to Trotsky, the work of revolutionizing North America is further complicated by the abominable obtuseness and caste presumption of the privileged upper strata of the working class itself, who refuse to recognize fellow workers and fighting comrades in the Negroes. This policy is at present time the most effective guarantee for the successful subjugation of white and colored workers alike. The fight against this policy must be taken up from various lines and on from various sides. One of the most important branches of this conflict consists in enlightening the proletarian consciousness by awakening the feeling of human dignity and revolutionary protest amongst the black slaves of American capital. This work can only be carried out by self-sacrificing and politically educated revolutionary Negroes. The SWP went so far as to predict that the political backwardness of white workers and the particularly intense oppression faced by blacks meant that it was possible, even likely, that the Negro workers will become the most advanced section of the class. They will furnish the vanguard of the American proletariat. And if you're thinking of the Black Panthers right about now, good on you. In a similar vein, C.L.R. James argued, the place of the Negroes is in the front of the class struggle. More than anyone else in the American SWP, and I'm running out of time, C.L.R. James tried to theorize the dialectical relationship between the independent self-activity of blacks in the US, which he saw as of fundamental importance for the political development of the proletariat and the class struggle more generally. He argued that the independent Negro movement is able to intervene with terrific force upon the general social and political life of the nation, even if it is not waged under the banner of socialism, but limited to democratic rights, and even if it is not led necessarily either by organized labor movement or the Marxist Party. The struggle for black liberation strikes at the very root of capitalism in the US even today. As it develops, the class differentiation within the black community itself can come to the fore. Sections of it, the middle class, even the capitalist element, or even its capitalist elements, would then steer it towards cooptation, as their own interests within capital start to be impinged. In this context, the organic intellectuals of the working class itself, coming from within the black working class, can emerge to struggle for leadership. As the struggle develops and capital itself faces a challenge that becomes more and more systemic, other sections of the working class are themselves forced to take a side, but in a new context, in the context of the real and present resistance that is taking place before them. This struggle can therefore be the signal that calls for the working class as a whole class, to take on its revolutionary responsibilities. In James's words, the independent Negro mass movement, by their agitation, resistance, and the political developments that they can initiate, can be the means whereby the proletariat is brought onto the scene. It's for this reason that the American SWP challenged any attempt to subordinate or to push to the rear the social and political significance of the independent political Negro struggle. Of course, the SWP as an organization want to be part of the development of the Black liberation movement. It hoped that its members could even exercise a leadership role in that movement, but not from the outside. Rather, it wanted to be part of that layer of, quote, politically educated revolutionary Negroes, blacks, that it believed the mass movement was developed. The responsibility of white socialists, not ignoring anything, was to offer critical but unconditional support. White socialist workers had to fight for the demands that the movement itself raised. In other words, the terms in which solidarity could be had were to be set by the Black liberation movement itself. Yours is to accept. So the revolutionary approach of the SWP towards Black liberation was to trust and also participate in, if it could, the agency and self-activity of the oppressed black population, even though it understood all too well that this involved a great deal of class heterogeneity on the part of the movement. But this was not in any sense a form of identity politics, whereby all blacks are assumed to have all interests in common, or that only black people can fight for black liberation. Rather, they insisted on the self-activity of the oppressed, because this was the only basis for the kind of solidarity that could reveal the duplicity of the middle-class blacks and the necessary unity of the entire working class. It is only by this activity that the blacks could, quote, draw the revolutionary elements and more powerful elements in the proletariat onto their side. But all this leaves at least one loose end. If you're an English socialist in Marxist time, or a socialist but not black like Trotsky's or even today, what does that leave you in relation to these struggles? If you are an English radical in 1870 and you believe that the English working class is impotent until the colonial oppression of Ireland is ended, you obviously don't just sit on your hands and wait until the Irish liberate themselves. What did Marx think was the responsibility of socialists in England in relation to the Irish struggle? So I'll quote Marx. The most important object of the International Working Men's Association is to hasten the social revolution in England. The sole means of hastening it is to make Ireland independent. Hence, it is the task of the International everywhere to put the conflict between England and Ireland in the foreground, and everywhere to side openly with Ireland. It is the special task of the Central Council in London to make the English workers realize that for them, the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. Of course, Marx is not saying that justice is not involved, but it has to do with their strategic need as a class and the nature of the working class. So I know I'm repeating myself, but the point was not that English socialists and workers had nothing to do with Irish struggle. Of course, it was necessary to very actively take the side of the Irish in it. My point, rather, is that the most important factor that made it possible in the first place to take their side at all was the simple fact that they themselves were resisting, the Irish themselves were resisting. I think it's fairly clear how this generalizes to the struggles around oppression today, running out of time. It should underscore the significance of the resurgence in indigenous nationalism or the appearance of Black Lives Matter. Probably the more correct thing to do would have been to write this talk around contemporary struggles against oppression instead of like obscure the Irish question or Trotsky's ideas about the Negro question in the 40s. Anyway, doing that. We live in politically volatile times. Avowed socialists are making serious bids for the highest seats of government. From Black Lives Matter to Al-Hid in Greece, from the Bernie Sanders campaign to the movement of occupation squares in France, to anti-fascist demonstrations in Germany, more and more people are calling the ruling class on their bullshit. In North America, as well as in much of the developed world, this has its roots in the crisis of neoliberalism. The ruling class has attempted to make workers pay for this crisis, and immigrants, disabled people, women, people of color, trans people, the people who historically have been made the most vulnerable, the people whose place in society has been the beachhead for every ruling class offensive, were once again marked out to feel the brunt of the ruling class's violence, austerity, and neglect. But in many cases, these same historically vulnerable communities have been leading the fight back. In North America today, oppression has been the breaking point of ruling class hegemony. And so, in a way, this parallels Trotsky and Marx's predictions. Now, quite apart from the specific points that I've been raising, I also want to convince you that Marxism offers a viable understanding of the political problems posed by oppression. But more than that, I want to convince you of the methodological principle of what I think are the best theories of our tradition. This is simply that the ideas of Marx, Trotsky, or C.L. James did not come from clever brains being clever. It came from clever activists who respected and took seriously the agency, intelligence, and power of the oppressed. Whereas liberals see in the oppressed only victims who must be helped or raised up, a particular current of revolutionary Marxism saw the force on which rested the very possibility of revolution and the fate of the entire working class.
Fantastic. So we have about 15-20 minutes for discussion. So what we'll do is I'll take a speakers list and we can go around and give comments, questions, strong interventions. Then you can do that, and then we'll turn it back over to the speakers to wrap up and respond to any points at the end. So I'll turn it over to you if you'd like to speak. Give a few minutes to collect our thoughts. Don't be afraid of the silence.
I sort of have a half-formed point, so I guess I'll just talk perfectly. It'll make sense by the end of my sentences. I think I was struck by, at the beginning of the talks, I can't remember which speaker said it, but I think it was Anton at the end, that the annoyance of capitalists is eventually rule over humans, and it would be nice if they were just beat with robots. And it sort of drew parallels with this increasing, I guess, advocacy for automation in essentially the hotbed of capitalism, Silicon Valley. And I want to essentially ask you how you see this essentially push for automation, for these easily manipulated robots in the place of people feeds into the class